Hello, my name is Justin, and I am new to the chess website. But I'm here to teach you guys chess. So let's go ahead and get right into it. Today, I'm going to talk about the two knights opening. So this is one of the most common openings in chess and a very great place to start. Doesn't matter what level you are, if you're a master, if you're a beginner, this is a great opening to play. So it starts with e4. This is the most common move. E5, and then white brings their knight out to attack our pawn in the center. So we want to defend that pawn. So we play knight to c6. We bring another piece into the party, and now we defend the central pawn. And in response to this, most white players play bishop to c4. So this is kind of how we get to the two knights opening. We play knight to f6, and as you can see, we have two knights out. That's, hence the name two knights opening. And these knights are great because in the opening, you want to control the center, and both of these knights do a great job of controlling the center. So again, this is a great opening no matter the level because it's based on the opening principles. So here, there's a lot of things that white can do. And we'll look at a few different options, but kind of the most advantageous and seen a lot at the lower level is the fried liver attack with knight to g5. So right away, white is being super aggressive, moving a piece twice in the opening, which is considered not great, not giving attention to their other pieces. Um, but what they do is they attack this pawn on f7. So we have to figure out how to defend it. And it's not so easy. There's not a great way to defend that pawn. None of our knights can defend that pawn, none of our bishops. It's really difficult to defend. We're defending it with our king, but that's not good enough because they have two attackers and we only have one defender. So now the only move to maintain equality in this position, so this is very important, is to play d5. It's to block this bishop from reaching this f7 square. So this is a very important move to remember. And even if you don't remember, it's important to remember why. Like, we're playing this move so that they cannot take on f7. Take on f7 would be really bad because they're going to fork our queen and rook with the knight. So d5 is very, very important. And then after d5, white will just take it. Otherwise, we're attacking their bishop, putting pressure on the e4 pawn. So after we take on d5, or sorry, after white takes on d5, now black also has a few options here. So in this position, um, a very common move from black is to play knight to d5. Knight takes d5. But this is actually a mistake. So it's not a mistake because it's not protected. It is protected. If white were to take, we would just take back, and that would be an even trade. But the reason this is bad is because white has a really crazy sacrifice. Knight takes f7. So they sacrifice their knight, and the only reason they do this is to bring our king out into the open. It's just left out to dry. They're going to play queen f3 check. They fork the king and the knight, and it's very difficult for black to do anything about this. If they just go back, well, white just won a free pawn because they won this pawn on f7 and then they traded a knight for a knight. So if if black really wants to keep this extra material, he has to be very advantageous and very scarily go out to this e6 square where the king is really pushing it, really pushing the limits as how far your king can go because it's very out in the open. And because your king is such an important piece, having it that open is very, very risky. So white's going to play knight to c3, put even more pressure on this guy. They're just going to castle, blast the center open with d4 at the right moment. And white has a very good play. again, because this king is just in the center without much protection at all. So let's go back. Um, Instead of knight takes d5, again, we don't want to take this pawn on d5 because it allows knight takes f7. So instead of this, I'm going to show two other options for black that are good or better. So first off, the main line, and when I say main line, I mean that like the top players in the world consider this the critical line. This is what they're playing, and this is what they consider to be the best. So the top players in the world play knight to a5. And what this does is it gets out of this attack while simultaneously attacking this bishop here on c4. So after knight to a5, white wants to preserve this bishop, so they play bishop to b5 check. If they were to just move this bishop anywhere, if they were just to retreat it, then we could take on d5 and our king would be a lot safer. So for example, say they retreat it here. We would take on d5, and then this knight takes f7 just isn't as strong because we can block with the knight. There's no pin on the knight anymore with this bishop on that diagonal, so the king is actually quite safe. So if we go back, knight to a5, white tries to continue to be provocative by playing bishop to b5 check, looking at our king. So we had to block it. Um, Bishop to d7 is an option, but the best move is actually c6. And c6 is actually a gambit. We lost this pawn on d5, and we're saying, you can go ahead and take another pawn. We're going to take one back, but you're up a pawn. Like, white is up a full pawn, but black does have a lot of compensation in return. So at first, it doesn't seem very clear, like, what is black's compensation, but the more you look at it, the more it becomes obvious. White's pieces are all very clumsy. If we start with like h6, knight to h3 is actually kind of one of the best moves, which is crazy because from h3, it can't go to either of these squares, and it looks so ridiculous out there. And knight to f3 is also problematic because e4, and then the knight goes to e5, and we just gain more time harassing this knight. You'll play bishop to c5 or bishop d6. A lot of good options here, and white can get into some trouble here. Queen to d4 is a nice idea in the position as well. So that's why c6 is considered a pretty strong idea here. And I also want to mention if the bishop went back to a4, this would be even worse because the bishop on a4 is not protected. Anytime there's an unprotected piece, we want to be able to take advantage of that. So first we start with h6. Again, it's the same thing, but after the knight goes back to f3, there we go. E4 is very strong because e4 attacks the knight, and the knight, again, doesn't have a lot of squares. It would get trapped if it went out to h4, and then if it went back to e5, like we just saw, queen to d4, again, attacks the undefended pieces. Both the knight and the bishop are undefended, and the queen attacks both simultaneously, and white can do nothing to save it. So it looks like bishop takes c6 is scary. It's easy to get caught up with our opponent's ideas, but after knight takes c6, knight takes c6, and a simple move like queen c5 or queen d5, this knight is going to be trapped. It has nowhere to go, and we're winning a whole piece. So just to recap the fried liver, after knight to g5, we're going to play d5 to interpose this diagonal, and then after d5, there's a whole lot of other options, but the best is to play knight to a5 to chase that bishop away, and then once it moves, you block with c6, gambiting a pawn, and then you just prioritize your development. The bishop moves back. Now here, this knight is in a very awkward spot, so we want to kick it around first. And then once we kick it around a little bit, now we play bishop c5, ready to play queen d4 and castle. All right, so let's look at a different line. So from the starting position, another line to look at is if white plays knight to c3. This is very common, again, especially at the lower levels, but it's already a mistake. It allows a very nice trick in the position for black. So take a minute and see if you can figure it out. Black is going to play knight takes e4. It looks like white just defended that pawn, right? That was the whole reason they played knight to c3, is to defend that pawn. But the problem is when the knight takes back on e4, the issue is these pieces are both unprotected and they're both vulnerable to attack. So we can fork them with d5. We're attacking both of them at the same time, and we're just going to win a piece back. At the end of the day, like for example, say they retreat and they take their pawn back. At the end of the day, we're going to be better because we have this pawn in the center and they don't have any pawns in the center. So we have better control of the center, giving us the advantage. So again, after knight c3, we have this center fork trick. Something else that's important to mention after knight takes e4, white can try something like bishop takes f7, essentially saying, I know my bishop's going to be lost, so I might as well take a pawn and ruin your castling in the process. But after this trade, black is still going to play d5, and white can give you a check, but your king is going to be pretty safe on g8. And what's going to tell the story here is this huge center. White just cannot compete with the center. This is the ideal center. We have both of our pawns in the center, controlling central squares. This is very, very nice. And our pieces are going to come out to very good squares. This bishop can come out to g4, bishop to c5. It's just a very comfortable position for black. Even though our king looks a little risky, it'll be okay. We can kick this knight out. We can bring our queen to protect our king. There's no real danger. So that was knight to c3. And then the other thing is sometimes white just says, I want to get my king out of the center as fast as possible, and they castle. But this is just a mistake because after this, we can just take this pawn, right? That's why we played knight to f6 was to attack this pawn, and they didn't defend it. So they might try to, develop a piece, attack our knight in the center, but we can just play d5. And d5 is such a crucial move because if we move the knights, then white would be able to take on e5 since their rook is now looking at that square. But d5 both protects the knight, attacks this bishop, and cements this knight on a beautiful square. It's just the central control again is fantastic. This is what we want out of the two knights opening. So castles is not anything to worry about. So I'll leave you with probably the best line. The best line here is for white to play d3. Again, this is the main line. This is what the top grandmasters in the world are playing. They're playing d3 here. And then after d3, black should play bishop to c5, develop their bishop out. They're going to play d6 next. Just continue their development, controlling the center as well. So white castles. And then after d6, again, we're just trying to get that bishop out. White usually plays h3. And then here is something I also want to note. We could castle here, but I find that when people castle here, they tend to forget about something important. So for example, if they castle, I'm just going to flip through a few moves to show what could happen. There's nothing wrong with castling, but it can lead to this kind of pin and the knight coming to d5, and this happens a lot, and it causes serious, serious problems for people. So this is what we want to avoid, and this is why we play h6 first. We just avoid this bishop coming to g5 altogether, and we're ready to finally castle and finish our development. This position is very equal, but this is kind of what the top players are playing. The only improvement that, you know, people are making here is potentially playing C3. C3 is aimed towards pushing D4 and claiming the center in the future. But again, play would follow very similarly, D6, potentially H6, castles, etc. So that was the two knights opening. Feel free to comment below if you have any questions, and have a great rest of your day.